right, guys, welcome back, Karsten. Welcome back, Jenny. Great to have you both here to talk about this very important week in climate. And so, Karsten, let's start with you. Let's talk about some of these key findings in this assessment report. What's the report saying? What does all this mean to us?
So, put this in context. The last time that the IPCC put out an assessment report was 2014. So it's been quite a while, and a lot has happened in terms of climate change and climate science since then. Mm-hmm. And this report really does a great job. Hundreds of authors collaborating on this thing and really getting a good synopsis of what's happening with the climate, both currently and projected by new models that have come out. And one of the amazing things, well, I wouldn't say amazing, but one of the things that is sort of unprecedented here is this, for the first time ever, really, this world body of scientists has said, look, unequivocally, this climate change, this global warming, is human induced. Mm-hmm. There's no doubt about it. We're not saying maybe anymore. It is, and that's a game changer in terms of the way these reports have gone in the past. So it's really important that this distinction has been made, because really that starts to frame that we can start to do something about it, because frankly it's something that we have helped to create.
Right. So if we think about since about 1970, global surface temperatures have risen faster, they say, than in any other 50-year period over the past 2,000 years. This is what is being reported in the news. And if we look at under all emission scenarios outlined in this new report, we're talking about that the Earth's surface warming is projected to reach 1.5 C or even 1.6 C in the next 2 decades, which also means that drastic reductions in CO2 would be needed this decade and net zero emissions by 2050. So what repercussions are unavoidable already?
One of the big ones is that really, even if we shut off all emissions today, a lot of the climate effects that are produced by those emissions are going to be felt and continue to happen for decades to millennia from now. That we have, in many senses, especially with regards to the ocean, have created a change that has such momentum that simply getting rid of that CO2 out of the atmosphere and not emitting it is going to take a long time for the system to recover from. Right. So that's a huge thing. And similarly, a lot of the things that we're seeing now, like more intense heat waves and more frequent heat waves, droughts, floods, these things will also continue to occur, even though we are heading, we may head in the right direction with reducing emissions.
Mm-hmm. And Jenny, I mean, this has repercussions in other places in the world as well. And it's not just in the form of heat, it's also in the form of water, right?
Yeah, I think what you see is, a shift in the overall water cycle, carbon cycle, and an acceleration of issues. And we have never seen, at least in our lifetime, anything like this. The shift in the water cycle and the changes that it will have has a whole lot of societal impacts and impacts to the amount of energy that is shifting, the intensification of events that will affect people, and including mass migration. Not to mention, the inability to survive catastrophic events. So, we're talking about a lot is going to be happening at a pace that we have not experienced in our life ever.
And in a really short amount of time.
In a very short amount of time. And you know, when you look at the kinds of things the scientists are saying as a result of some of the engagement and communication efforts as part of this IPCC report, you know, one, you hear statements like, you know, scientists are scared. That's a statement in and of itself. But you also hear statements like, you know, all hope is not lost. And so, you know, how do we communicate this information rapidly to not only policymakers, but to individuals and citizens and human beings all over the world, and think about the little and big changes that can be made, or simply just be aware and be prepared.
Mm-hmm.
It's quite serious and dire, and there's nothing about it that is funny. And so when you think about the communication side of things of this report, you know, there are lots of experts in climate communications that are trying to develop modes and methods and effective communication and of this information, so it reaches the people in the way that they want to be reached. And, you know, we are hearing that sometimes you need to add humor into the language so that it reaches a certain demographic. And there's just nothing funny about this.
Yeah, I think it's a tough subject, and I think part of the you know, being on the climate communication side is that, you know, we're trying to digest this report's over 3,500 pages, and we're trying to take this really weighty subject and translate it into a layman's terms, you know, digestible format, to allow people to see where the dangers are, and, like you said before, where the hopes lay. So yeah, just a really interesting time to be you know, looking at this particular report. But Karsten, I wanted to come back. You know, we see that it says 1.5 by 2040, or even 1.6, but it really, like you said before, it really for the first time looked at you know, the human activity cause. AR5, the previous report, concluded that, you know, human influence on the climate system is clear. So how does AR6 go even further?
You know, it says it shifts from saying, you know, this human influence is clear to this is caused by people. And it went even further to say that of the change that has occurred to date, since they used the 1850 to 1900 as a baseline, and the change from that time to now, they estimate that all but 1/10 of a degree of that change is due to human activity.
Wow.
That natural variability only accounts for 1/10 of a degree of change in that time.
Yeah, I see they use the word very, or the words very likely.
Yeah, that's a step up. So the report uses a sort of a standardized language of their level of confidence in the results: low confidence, medium confidence, high confidence, virtual certainty, and as well as a likelihood, rather, as you know, as well as the likelihood of something occurring. And for the first time in a lot of these reports, they're using quite readily, they're using terms like almost certain to describe these changes, that the models have evolved such that there's really very little doubt in any climatologist's mind that this is in fact happening or going to happen, and that the faith in the models, the evaluations of these models is saying, look, we don't see any reason why this won't happen. And that's a real that's what's scaring the scientists, is that they are so sure of these things now.
Right.
Usually in science, there's a wiggle room of saying, well, you know, based on what we've looked at, this is the most likely scenario, but there's, obviously there's a lot of uncertainty still in there. That uncertainty is pretty much gone in this report.
Described barefoot luxury, the casually sophisticated Southern Cross Club is Little Cayman's original resort. This hidden gem is as unique and vibrant as the island it inhabits. A true island treasure, it is the perfect place to dive, fish, and relax. Its 14 beachfront bungalows are situated on 900 feet of white sand, only minutes from the world-class diving found only in Little Cayman. Visit www.southerncrossclub.com to book your escape to tranquility. If we think of the attribution science, what do we understand from this about the ramifications for the world?
IPCC reports and in the United States, the National Climate Assessments give a lot of explanation and peer-reviewed perspective on the impacts of different circumstances and events and how they manifest into different parts of society, such as agriculture, energy, infrastructure, construction, all those different impacts. So it's pretty well understood for the most part in many of these sectors what the impacts are. If you ask me, my personal perspective is, at the end of the day, this really calls for a massive systemic change in how the world views consumption of materials, consumption of energy, utilization of the available resources, and for what purpose, and how efficiently and effectively they use it. And that it's incredibly complex, and we're asking for a fundamental systemic change in how we live our lives, both developing countries as well as developed countries. And it's a very difficult conversation to even begin to have, even within a household, let alone at a policy level. Yet we are dealing with non-renewable resources that are impacted and affected, not to mention catastrophic events that we experience that cause loss of life and property. And so when I think about how some of the business leaders are thinking about the topics and some of the top minds, we're talking about reimagining the concept of capitalism, thinking about reshifting the way we define capitalism.
It will be a paradigm shift.
And if not, it will be forced upon us, whether we like it or not, whether it's forced upon us by nature, causing an extreme event that we will have to deal with, or let's say a more complex way, and that is through policy. And we know that living in a free democratic society, that's a very difficult thing to kind of even contemplate of how do you create and have those discussions. But if you don't, it will be forced upon us by nature. So we need to start having these conversations on shifting the way we think about our life, the things that we need and what we don't need, thinking about the waste that we produce, thinking about the consumption. I think we need to think about what makes, how we define meaning for our life, and then how we teach that to our children.
I mean, in the developed world, we're talking about ramifications of, homeowners insurance and infrastructure and taxation, and the way the money is used by developed countries. But in countries around the world that are not as well developed, we're talking, like you said before, about migration. We're talking about food ramifications.
Conflict.
So, pardon me? Conflict. Yeah.
Yep. Scarcity of natural resources required to sustain life. And we've seen that happen. We have enough experience in the recent decade of events and circumstances that have shown what has happened when you have extreme drought scenarios, what that does to the individual who's selling bread on the street, the conflict that it creates, and how that's magnified at geopolitical level risk, and what that means to, let's say, the United Nations, or how developing nations have to provide support. We have enormous amount of experience from history. What happens when there isn't food or scarcity of food?
Mm-hmm. So let's talk a bit about something new that's in the report. We've got now, I believe for the first time, Karsten, and feel free to correct me, but it talks quite intensively about regional impacts or regional climate impacts. What can you tell us about that?
Well, yeah. So the previous reports have delved into regional impacts. So that in itself is not overly new. But what is new and interesting about the regional impacts in this report is that some of the larger impacts, like heat waves, droughts, floods, things like that, they're showing that just about every region of Earth will be affected by these things. But what's interesting is one of the things that's very interesting about this is just the evolution of the regional climate models that are being used now to look at what's changing at a much finer scale in these regions, and those models have matured greatly and are now tied directly into a lot of these global climate models, rather than being run after the fact. So they're giving a lot more information, and that's a lot more based in the atmospheric physics, as opposed to statistical downscaling and things where they're taking relationships to bring them down to a finer scale. So the regional findings that they're pointing to, they have much greater confidence in what those are saying. And what's really alarming is how much change and extreme events they're seeing in the high latitudes, the Arctic and such, and the Antarctic. They say it's virtually certain that by 2040 or 2050, there will be an ice-free September in the Arctic oceans. So that's huge. I mean, the Arctic sea ice has been declining for many decades now, but to have a completely ice-free September is something that hasn't happened certainly in any sort of recorded history.
And that comes into the next point, which is the tipping points, right? This is one of the tipping points that they're talking about, and I mean, this will have tremendous repercussions through the ecology of the region.
It will.
Of the region and surrounding regions, and the circulations, the oscillations. It will have ramifications globally. It will have ramifications everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and one of the things that's really critical in looking at this is that the Arctic contains a great deal of permafrost, and permafrost has locked up within it gigatons of methane.
Mm-hmm.
And as that permafrost starts to thaw, it will be releasing methane, which is a far more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, right, into the atmosphere, which may offset a lot of the reductions that we might achieve as a society.
Right. And they've addressed that now in this short-term aerosols, I think it's, or short-term climate forces, I think they termed it. So methane falling under that category then.
Yeah.
So not just from cows.
Cows are likely a relatively small component relative to what would be released by permafrost melting and from these new wetlands that are being created, where once was frozen tundra. But some of the other effects are that they're seeing a potential slowdown or even collapse of the Atlantic overturning circulations, which is what pumps heat up into the high latitudes and brings cool water down to the tropics and regulates our global climate.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, to use those terms that you came up before about you know, the confidence, you know, high confidence or low confidence, where do we stand with the tipping points with regard to the Arctic and with regard to the ocean circulation?
With regards to the Arctic, it's very high confidence. I'd have very high confidence. With regards to the ocean circulation, I believe it's medium confidence, medium to high.
Well, what about you mentioned before, Jenny, the flow of information. Who is receiving this information? Who is this information going to? Because it's complex, it's in depth, it's complicated and not easily digestible. So you mentioned before the importance of climate communication, but who is actually receiving it?
Well, where we were at the last release of the report versus where we are at this time has evolved significantly. I think there has been enough attention in the media that has caused individual citizens all the way to scientists, nation leaders, climate change officers within each nation that negotiate terms and discussions on emissions. It's reaching those that are involved in the conversations, but I think because of social media and the amount of attention that the younger generation has placed and prioritized climate and environmental issues, I think it's reaching and it's starting to reach more people, but it's not enough. It is not permeating at the conversation level that causes teachers and students and business leaders and industry leaders and policymakers and to act in a way that causes a response and a change. It is not fast enough. We are not embedding this information quickly enough to make pivots and changes and innovate solutions. You know, there's an understanding that because of the amount of impact due to emissions already committed in the atmosphere and the ocean, we will have to adapt and develop resiliency. When it comes to the solutions required to adapt and be resilient, we are not innovating fast enough. The one thing that I have seen recently in the past 6 to 8 months, maybe 10 months, is the amount of attention brought to the problem by financial institutions and investors, and the amount of financial resources that are starting to be poured into the opportunity. It's starting to mobilize. It's not enough. So I think, you know, when you think about who needs to hear it, individual households, we need more social media attention. We need citizen science involved. We need to be able to discuss it, that this is science-based findings. This is not a matter of an opinion. And what's hard about this problem is, you know, in this generation, in many people's lifetimes, they still feel like that the impacts are far away. But we're talking about impacts, you know, in my children's generation, in their time frame, and their children's time frame. So that
2100 is only 80 years from now.
That time window is narrowing.
With so many wonderful destinations around the world to choose from, a little help can go a long way. Quest Dive Adventures is your premium adventure travel company, offering a wide and diverse selection of destinations to choose from, with dive adventures from the Pacific to the Caribbean and adventure travel from Costa Rica to Africa. Quest Dive Adventures offers packages including flights and accommodations, activities, transfers, diving, and more. Everything to enjoy your perfect vacation. What's your request? We're virtually, with all the models, guaranteed to reach 1.5 in the very, very near foreseeable future. So if we think about that dialogue, how can we improve upon the messaging and allow to spread that message a little easier in a more digestible way so that people can make better decisions, whether it be in local legislation and otherwise?
That's a great question. I think, going to trust, so there are lots of different perspectives on the belief of climate change and where people are on the spectrum. As you can see with what has happened with the global pandemic, there's still a lot of questions and disbelief towards scientific-based findings. So how do we reach individuals within the system and the belief system that they rely and trust upon? So I think scientific sources and scientific communicators have to develop sources and methods and channels that individuals rely upon as their go-to. Some prefer to use a news channel. Some people prefer to use their church. Some people prefer to use a community neighborhood association. Some people prefer to use the printed newspaper. Some people trust CNN. Some people trust WMO. I think it's all hands on deck, communicate the information at the place where they trust and go to that trusted enterprise and go to that trusted source and help just provide clarity.
It may take, a sort of a wholesale shift in the way society addresses some of these things. For example, 1.5 degree Celsius warming is going to produce a 2 to 3 meter rise in sea level. That's pretty certain. 2 degrees will produce something around 2 to 6 meters.
Mm-hmm.
So, if we know this, and we need to say, look, if you are living at a level less than this, we need to figure out how to move you or adapt you to having this new sea level.
Where this problem becomes very complex is amount of resources allocated to those individuals that live in a high risk zone, whether it's wildfire or along the coast or near the river that's expected or anticipated to have extreme flooding events. That individual that is dealing with that particular impact affects those that are not near that location, because as a result of continued impacts, you have insurance companies pulling out, required or not, or mandated by law or not, there's still an impact. And those that live far away from the locations where the event is occurring have to pay the price one way or the other, because you either have scarcity of resources or a shift in the pattern of delivery of resources. And consequently, that creates competition and cost and rises of commodities or raw materials. You have mass migration that creates demand for resources or scarcity of resources. We're unprepared to address the volumes of mass migration that we have experienced, resulting from either island nation sinking or coastal impacts, and particularly the wildfires. The wildfires are extremely difficult and painful to watch as people are running and suffering, and you see insurance companies challenged with having to provide support and insurance for homes that are still choosing to be located in these regions.
I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of, this is a roadmap that is being produced here that says this is what we need to be prepared for. And thus far, we have not prepared as a society for these things in a large scale. Maybe individual communities have here and there, maybe some states or provinces or counties have, and maybe some individuals have, but for the most part, a society, a large swath of society is simply not prepared for any of this.
And you make a good point. Those that are and have been experiencing climate change impacts, and those that are responding with resilience and adaptation strategies, arguably are far ahead of the game. And so what I fear is, we're talking about there will be winners and there will be losers. And even when you have those that are suffering, you have intervention, whether it's by government or non-governmental organizations that provide aid and relief, it is still a consumption of resources that is being shifted from location X to location Y. And when you have a history and a continuation and a long-term behavior pattern of these shifting of resources, you are creating complexity, tension, competition, and price cost implications. The undertone of all that is either migration, conflict, and we've seen this. We have a historical experience of uprisings. And so it's just really destabilizing. But, this is it seems quite negative to talk about it in that context. I think one of the questions that is not often discussed is, what can we do now? What are the opportunities? How do we leverage the power of citizen science and data and information to start mobilizing the change that needs to happen?
Yeah,
it is very possible. So
you bring me to what I want to talk about next, and that's hope. So the report actually does contain a little bit of hope, because it does say that if we cut global emissions in half by 2030 and reach net zero by the middle of the century, then we can halt and possibly reverse some of the negative effects that we see are happening within the climate conditions. So and
we'll see that within 20 years or so.
Say that again?
We'll see that within 20 years or so of that happening.
But yeah, it's an incredibly complex question to ask, and yet it's so simple to think about. Think about how you would cut your life and how you operate and live your life, and the consumption that is occurring at the individual household and the community level and the state level and the region level. Just think, and even at a national level, how can we change our behavior patterns so that we are creating less burden on production and generation that produces these emissions?
It'll be difficult since, our entire economic system is based on consumption.
And competitiveness, which means that we're,
yes.
So it's as simple as, do I need to have a new technological advancement on my phone every 2 years so that it consumes more materials for production? It's really complex to ask those questions, but is it possible? Yes, it certainly is possible.
And a mix of developed countries and not as well developed countries performing as best they can. Developed countries changing the way that they produce energy, and developing countries adopting new technologies as they become available. Carbon sequestration in all forms, both technical and natural. We have a lot of work to do, and it's not just on the individuals. It's not just at the regional level, as we discovered. It's everyone, everywhere. I did want to ask Karsten. We spoke about regional observations before, but how can hyper-local observations change the understanding as we know it today?
They can change it dramatically. One of the biggest challenges with running any of these models is the amount of data that can be input into them. These models are only as good as the data that are available, and we still only have, a few tens of thousands of observation stations to cover the entire planet. And so every additional data point in a local area helps us better understand how conditions are changing. I'll just take my own community here, for example. Yesterday, the National Weather Service said it reached 100 Fahrenheit at the airport, the official observing station for the community. And that was, that's pretty unprecedented. That's the record for the community, the new all-time record. But it ignited a firestorm on my social media feeds with everybody in town saying, that's not right. It only hit 86 at my house, and it was only 92 at my house. And over here at the lake, it was, 81. And
Where
and
and
such.
Carson, where is this? Can you
This is
say
it.
where?
This is in Bellingham, Washington.
Yeah.
And so that just showed. And Bellingham, if you look at the geography, it's sitting on the north part of Puget Sound near the Straits of Juan de Fuca, and it's backed up into the Cascades. So there's a lot of topography change over short distance. It's right along the water, but then it goes inland into forest and such. So you do see a great deal. I mean, this is many degrees of change over very short distances, and that can have significant impacts on how a individual on one side of town may be affected by climate change versus an individual on the other side of town. And what's important to them, what they need to consider. So any additional information, any reasonably valid data points that can be added to those models, added to the mix, is absolutely crucial for better understanding.
And I mean, as humans, these are inconveniences. We have to consider moving. We have to throw money into building seawalls. We have to, to do mitigations of some form. But when we talk about species, now we have a completely different consideration, because species themselves may not have the ability to move, whether it be animal or plant. So definitely. And in your case, we were talking about the airport reporting at a higher observation than the surrounding, but it's quite capable of doing the opposite.
Absolutely. And you bring up a really interesting point from our society standpoint too, the crops we grow. If we're no longer able to grow them in the places that we grow them now, where will we grow them? One of the biggest problems we have is not necessarily that climate may change, is that we don't have the capacity to change the infrastructure right now. So we could potentially start growing crops farther north in the Arctic as it warms, but we don't have the roads or systems or even soil up there to make that feasible. So we really have to consider a lot of things in addition to climate when it comes to its effect on biological systems.
And go ahead, Jen.
We often, when you think about, yes, there will be some good and bad to the changes and the impacts, but we often sort of don't have a fingerprint on the unintended consequences of the behavior change, the supply change. Simply because we have more growing bands and growing regions doesn't necessarily mean that it won't have any other unintended consequences. Putting an infrastructure in place to kind of shift the supply and the delivery of those materials comes with its own implication and costs. So I don't think we know what all that looks like just yet. And I don't think we've modeled it. I mean, I think there has been a lot of advancement in trying to understand these different scenarios. I think a lot of scientists are examining all kinds of scenarios to understand, but then there's the actual implementation capacity.
I see you were starting to see it in some of the commodities like coffee and even in things like wine, where the wine is being grown in different regions. And that's come for quite some time now, but it's definitely starting to impact the growers in such a way that they have to change their business.
So Neil, a question for you. You've asked us a whole lot, and you are in the role of communication of information, and you're in the role of recognizing the importance of citizen science for data collection, and through a whole lot of these podcast series, you have really brought to light very complex, difficult conversations by interviewing experts and discussing with us. As a recent advanced individual with climate information and climate communications, what modes and methods do you think should be applied to permeate this information into the hands of decision makers, individuals, business and industry? What would you like to see have happen?
That's a hard question to answer, Jenny. I think that the landscape is changing very quickly in the way that people consume information. We know that to be true of just social media platforms in general, but also the way that we accept news information in print media and some of the channels you were mentioning before, where people digest it from TV and sources like that. But the level at which the conversation is elevating is really interesting. And when Karsten and I interviewed Jason Boyer recently, the meteorologist from ABC News 13, he also mentioned the same thing, that the level of conversation is much higher now, where he's being asked a much more difficult question from broadcasters to answer and pass that over to just general people. But what I am seeing is that there is a key element with the understanding of people's ability to consume complex information that is as heavily weighted as climate. There's an implied ability there's a natural turn away point as people consume information that is hard. When they see tragedy, when they see wildfire, when they see migration that's occurring because of starvation and famine and things that are occurring in places around the world, there's a natural aversion away from it. And so, as in the communication of climate, yes, we need to understand the facts, but we also need to find a way to present people an opportunity to participate in their own future. So what I am seeing is that people are wanting to participate. People they're hearing about change. They may not want to read all of the very complex information that people are throwing at them, but their awareness is growing to a point where they do want to participate and find out how they themselves can make changes, and whether that be on the individual level, where they make changes by choosing paper instead of plastic at the checkout counter, or taking their own bags when they go grocerying, or choosing to keep a metal straw in their handbag. Those are nice choices, but they're making much bigger choices, as we know, in installing solar in their roofs and choosing to take service from providers that are more sustainably minded.
So what I hear you saying is providing easy, digestible, reachable, and solution-based options, right, that make the decision easier for the individual.
Yeah, it's too complex otherwise.
Yeah,
it's almost like at the end of a story on the news where some apartment fire, they say visit our website to find out how you can help these families. There's a solution at the end of this, that it's not just bad news. It's like, here's how you can help.
Right.
I think you're absolutely right in providing that sort of spectrum of yes, things are looking bleak here, the climate is changing, things are bad, there's a wildfire over here, but here's some ways you can help. Here's something that you can do in your life that makes a meaningful difference.
So what we're saying is that there should be a list of easy to deploy, low cost solutions that, if magnified at a greater scale, at a regional scale, at a national scale, would be meaningful, and then supplement that with the more complex and sophisticated change, like energy source and choosing a certain type of vehicle that minimizes emissions, things like that.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I think we see what we see is what we've already seen in a number of scenarios, where the solution will have an economic impact on some industry that already exists and is quite happy with the status quo, and a new technology comes along that's, say, less polluting, and we'd love to embrace it, but there's a very big pushback by those who are vested into the old system. And it's difficult to overcome that inertia in many cases.
Yeah,
we have to find a way to kind of enable transition in a digestible way, and for society to recognize that there's transition risk and that there are ways to address that transition risk. I think we've seen the most perfect example of how we have very interestingly shifted over from coal, fossil fuel-based sources for energy towards where the market is today, where renewables are totally dominating. That doesn't quite address what is happening at the scale for climate change. Or, electricity production, consumption still has implications, but it's shifting. And I think, I suppose one of the comments I would like to make is, having more conversations about the transition and the method of how to transition, the options that are available to transition, and how to address the transition risk, and where we are today versus where we need to be as rapidly as possible. That might help make individuals make the transition. And I find that we're not probably talking enough about that.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's the how do you do it versus, digesting and accepting the fact to have to do it. Then how do you do it? And how do we make that easy?
Yeah, and the weight of the responsibility lies amongst those that are educated in the topic, because we carry along with us the weight of knowing that there are many in the world that do not have the ability to make the decisions and choices that we have. And yet our actions are having an effect on them based upon the ramifications in the climate.
So there's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah.
There's still a glimmer of hope. I think change is possible. I think our own choices and behavior change is possible. So let's get to it.
Well, I couldn't agree more, and I thank you both for making time tonight to discuss a weighty subject once again, but an interesting topic, an interesting report coming from the IPCC, and we'll stand by to see what the remaining three reports in support of this come out to say, and I'm quite sure that we will convene again for another episode. So thanks so much for everyone for making time tonight.
Thanks, Neil.
Thank you, Karsten. Thanks, Neil.
Anytime.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of the 2 Degrees C Climate Chat. If you have a question you would like answered, a topic for discussion, or would like to be a guest on the show, please leave a comment below. We'd love to hear your stories and climate journeys, and if you like what you've heard today, please like, subscribe, and comment wherever you hear your podcasts. Thank you to our sponsors and partners without which this podcast is not possible, with special thanks to Seren Media for producing today's episode. To find out more about our partners, please visit our website, and if you'd like to become a sponsor or partner, please email us at podcast@2degreesc.org.